call Jenny Salisa.
Thank you, Mr Chair, for the opportunity to speak on the Accident Compensation Financial Responsibility and Transparency Amendment Bill. Labor supports this bill, Mr Chair, but with amendments to Part 1. I find it quite ironic, Mr Chair, that the government is putting through a bill with transparency in the title, given Murray McCulley's bribe of a Saudi businessman with no transparency whatsoever. Mr Chair, my colleague Sue Moroney has an SOP on Part 1, which first clarifies the interpretation of public good as meaning the public interest with regard to reducing injury and accidents in Section 300 of the Accident Compensation Act 2001. And secondly, the Labor SOP ensures that the government sets levies for the purposes outlined in Section 3 of the Act and not for the purpose of achieving other objectives unrelated to ACC levies, such as a government surplus. Mr Chair, Part 1 of this bill has the intention of consolidating and clarifying the framework for funding ACC's levied accounts to make it more transparent, to give it a longer-term focus, and to address the previously inconsistent approach to setting levies with marked fluctuations in levy rates and prior confusion about factors driving final decisions on levies. Mr Chair, Clause 5 of this bill, which inserts new subsection 166A to 166C into the Principal Act, deals with the principles of financial responsibility in relation to accounts. The proposed Section 166A, subsection 1, does indeed lay out the cost of all claims under the levied accounts to be fully funded by meeting the outstanding claims liability in respect of the claims, by offsetting an adequate level of assets to fund the cost of those claims. However, under the version of the proposed subsection 2 now before us, the principles under which levies must be set, where the Minister is obliged to have regard, is now changed. It is no longer mandated that the levies derived for each account must meet the lifetime cost of claims in relation to injuries that occur in a particular year, but merely that they should. It is no longer mandated that should an account have a deficit of funds to meet the costs described in paragraph A in subsection 1, or has accumulated surplus funds, that deficit or surplus must be corrected by setting of levies at an appropriate rate for a subsequent year or years, but that merely that they should. So I agree with Clayton Mitchell from New Zealand First when he was talking about the use of must or the term should. It is no longer mandated that large changes in levies must be avoided, but that merely that they should. Mr Chair, there is considerable consultation and debate when these things were discussed over at the Select Committee stage, Mr Chair, in terms of the widely swinging levies amongst ACC issues. The Minister of ACC announced in May that the legislation should bring about levy setting process into line with accountability and transparency requirements that already apply to the operation of the government's core budget under the Public Finance Act. The Minister at the time also announced that new binding principles should be introduced to ensure the scheme is adequately funded to withstand economic volatilities, while ensuring that the levies are kept as low as possible and to be stable over time. But Mr Chair, how is this proposed amendment enshrining in law the solution to the issues raised in advance from officials and from businesses and industry groups? The obligations on the Minister, Mr Chair, which should ensure that the levies are in fact more stable, have been muted for no apparent good reason. This is like the Health and Safety Reform Bill all over again, Mr Chair. The wording of some of the clauses has been changed, with a resulting weakening of the legislative framework. And these changes to the parameters of the Minister's decisions and obligations seem to have been sprung unheralded on the public. It is my understanding, Mr Chair, that the focus of the submissions to the Select Committee did not actually focus on this. Mr Chair, Labor is supporting this bill, but I must note that the weakening of the framework in relation to transparency and stability of the levies is regrettable. Thank you, Mr Chair.
I call Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Chairman.